Get me to read more this year. Right now, I'm reading The Stranger by Albert Camus. On part 2, chapter 3. How many more chapters there are? 4, because I plan on reading 2. 5. Is there a 6th chapter I don't know about? I think there is. No, there isn't. So there, do I want to crank out 3 chapters and finish this book? I don't know. Not necessarily opposed in principle, but we'll see how I feel after the first 2, or for 2 chapters. Chapter 3. But I can honestly say that... Oh wait, no, I should probably think about what happened in the last one. I have no idea. It's been a couple days. How long has it been since I last read this? This one have 33 views. That's crazy. 3 days ago? I don't even remember. Alright, I'm gonna try and think about what happened. Let me read the last page. Smile at it. I moved the plate around in front of me. Smiled at it. Okay, so wait, that's where he's in jail, or he's in prison, or whichever. He's locked up. He's in jail. He's looking at his reflection in a tin plate. And he passes the time. It had been about 5 months passed by, and he just exercises. He's kind of used to not smoking now. He compartmentalizes his memory. So, okay. The whole segment with Marie. Okay, it's coming back. It's flooding back in now. But I can honestly say that the time from summer to summer went very quickly. And I knew as soon as the weather turned hot that something new was in store for me. My case was set down for the last session of the Court of Assizes, and that session was due to end sometime in June. The trial opened with the sun glaring outside. My lawyer had assured me that it wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 days. Besides, he added, the court will be pressed for time. Yours isn't the most important case of the session. Right after you, there's a parricide coming up. Parricide? I remember reading something about, like, along the rules of Buddhism. They have, like, I feel like that's like a killing of parents. Okay, so yeah. The killing of a parent or a near relative. Okay. So when you kill your parents, it's a parricide. So things like infanticide. Matricide? What is matricide? Make sure I have that correct. Is it your mom? Yeah, okay, so when you kill your mother, it's a matricide. Patricide's probably probably your dad. They came for me at 7:30 in the morning, and I was driven to the courthouse in the prison van. The 2 policemen took me into a small room that smelled of darkness. We waited, seated near a door through which we could hear voices, shouts, chairs being dragged across the floor, and a lot of commotion, which made me think of those neighborhood fetes when the hall is cleared for dancing after the concert. The policeman told me we had to wait for the judges, and one of them offered me a cigarette, which I turned down. Shortly after that, he asked me if I had the jitters. I said no, and that in a way I was even interested in seeing a trial. I'd never had the chance before. Yeah, said the other policeman, but it gets a little boring after a while. A short time later, a small bell rang in the room, then they took my handcuffs off. They opened the door and led me into the dock. The room was packed. Despite the blinds, the sun filtered through in places and the air was already stifling. They hadn't opened the windows and I sat down with the policemen standing on either side of me. It was then that I noticed a row of faces in front of me. They were all looking at me. I realized that they were the jury, but I can't say what distinguished one from another. I had just one impression. I was sitting across from a row of seats on a streetcar, and all these anonymous passengers were looking over the new arrival to see if they could find something funny about him. I knew it was a silly idea since it wasn't anything funny they were after but a crime. I had just one impression. Oh, okay. There isn't much difference, though in any case, that was the idea that came to me. I was feeling a little dizzy, too, with all those people in that stuffy room. I looked around the courtroom again, but I couldn't make out a single face. I think that at first I hadn't realized that all those people were crowding to see me. Usually people don't pay much attention to me. It took some doing on my part to understand that I was the cause of all the excitement. I said to the policeman, "Some crowd." He told me it was because of the press, and he pointed to a group of men at a table just below the jury box. He said, "That's them." I asked, "Who?" He repeated, "The press." He knew one of the reporters, who just then spotted him and was making his way toward us. He was an older, friendly man with a twisted little grin on his face. He gave the policeman a warm handshake. I noticed then that everyone was waving and exchanging greetings and talking, as if they were in a club where people are glad to find themselves among another from the same world. That is how I explained to myself the strange impression I had of being an odd man out, a kind of intruder. Yet the reporter turned and spoke to me with a smile. He told me that he hoped everything would go well for me. I thanked him, and he added, "You know, we've blown your case up a little. Summer is the slow season for the news, and your story and the parricide were the only ones worth bothering about." Then he pointed in the direction of the group he had just left, at a little man who looked like a fattened-up weasel. He told me that the man was a special correspondent for a Paris paper. Actually, he didn't come because of you, but since they assigned him to cover the parricide trial, they asked him to send a little dispatch about your case at the same time. And again, I almost thanked him, but I thought that would be ridiculous. He waved cordially, shyly, and left us. We waited a few more minutes. My lawyer arrived in his gown, surrounded by lots of colleagues. He walked over to the reporters and shook some hands. They joked and laughed and looked completely at ease, until the moment when the bell in the court rang. Everyone went back to his place. My lawyer walked over to me, shook my hand, and advised me to respond briefly to the questions that they would put me in. Oh, okay. Respond briefly to the questions that would be put to me, not to volunteer anything, and to leave the rest to him. To my left, I heard the sound of a chair being pulled out, and I saw a tall, thin man dressed in red and wearing a pince-nez who was carefully folding his robe as he sat down. That was the prosecutor, a bailiff said. "All rise." At the same time, 2 large fans started to whir. 3 judges, 2 in black, the 3rd in red, entered with the files in hand and walked briskly to the rostrum which dominated the room. The man in the red gown sat on the chair in the middle, set his cap down in front of him, wiped his bald little head with a handkerchief, and announced that the court was now in session. The reporters already had their pens in hand. They all had the same indifferent and somewhat snide look on their faces. One of them, however, much younger than the others, wearing gray flannels and a blue tie, had left his pen lying in front of him and was looking at me. All I could see was his slightly lopsided face where his two very bright eyes, which were examining me closely without betraying any definable emotion. And I had the odd impression of being watched by myself. Maybe it was for that reason, and also because I wasn't familiar with all the procedures, that I didn't quite understand everything that happened next. Drawings of lots of the jury, the questions put by the presiding judge to any lawyer, the prosecutor, and the jury, each time the jurors' heads would all turn towards the bench at the same time, and quick reading of the indictment, in which I recognized names of people and places and some questions to my lawyer. Anyway, the presiding judge said he was going to proceed with the calling of witnesses. The bailiff read off some names that caught my attention. In the middle of what until then had been a shapeless mass of spectators, I saw them stand up one by one, only to disappear again through a side door. The director and caretaker from the home, old Thomas Perez, Ramon, Masson, Salamano, and Marie. She waved me anxiously. I was still feeling surprised that I hadn't seen them before when Celeste, the last to be called, stood up. I recognized next to him the little woman from the restaurant with her jacket and her stiff and determined manner. She was staring right at me, but I didn't have time to think about them, because the presiding judge started speaking. He said that the formal proceedings were about to begin, and that he didn't think he needed to remind the Republic to remain silent. According to him, he was there to conduct in an impartial manner the proceedings of a case which he would consider objectively. The verdict returned by the jury would be taken in a spirit of justice, and in any event, he would have the courtroom cleared at the slightest disturbance. It was getting hotter, and I could see the people in the courtroom fanning themselves with newspapers, which made a continuous low rustling sound. The presiding judge gave a signal, and the bailiff brought over 3 fans made of woven straw, which the 3 judges started waving immediately. Yeah, don't bleach me out. My examination began right away. The presiding judge questioned me calmly and even, it seemed to me, with a hint of cordiality. Once again, he had me state my name, age, date, and place of birth, and although it irritated me, I realized it was only natural, because it would be a very serious thing to try the wrong man. Then he reread the narrative of what I had done, turning to me every few sentences to ask, "Is that correct?" Each time I answered, "Yes, Your Honor," as my lawyer had instructed me to do. It took a long time because the judge went into minute detail in his narrative. The reporters were writing the whole time. I was conscious of being watched by the youngest of them and by the little robot woman. Everyone on the row of streetcar seats was turned directly towards the judge, who coughed, leafed through his file, and turned towards me, fanning himself. He told me that he now had to turn to some questions that might seem irrelevant to my case, but might in fact have a significant bearing on it. I knew right away he was going to talk about Mammon again, and at the same time I could feel how much it irritated me. He asked me why I had put Mammon in the home. I answered that it was because I didn't have the money to have her looked at and cared for. He asked me if it had been hard on me. I answered that Mammon and I didn't expect anything from each other anymore, or from anyone else either, and that we both had gotten used to our new lives. The judge then said that he didn't want to dwell on this point, and he asked the prosecutor if he had any further questions. The prosecutor had his back half turned to me, and without looking at me, he stated that, with the court's permission, he would like to know whether I had gone back to the spring by myself intending to kill the Arab. No, I said. Well then, why was I armed, and why did I return precisely to that spot? I said it just happened that way, and that the prosecutor noted in a nasty voice, "That will be all for now." After that, things got a little confused, and at least for me. But after some conferring, the judge announced that the hearing was adjourned until the afternoon, at which time the witnesses would be heard. I didn't even have time to think. I was taken out put into the van and driven to the prison, where I had something to eat. After a very short time, just long enough for me to realize I was tired, they came back for me, the whole thing started again, and I found myself in the same courtroom, in front of the same faces. It was Only it was much hotter, and as if by some miracle each member of the jury, the prosecutor, my lawyer, and some of the reporters, too, had been provided with straw fans. The young reporter and the little robot woman were still there. They weren't fanning themselves, but they were still watching me without saying a word. I wiped away the sweat covering my face, and I had barely become aware of where I was and what I was doing, and when I heard the director of the home being called. He was asked whether Mammon ever complained about me, and he said yes, but some of it was just a way the residents all had of complaining about their relatives. The judge had him clarify whether she used to reproach me for having her put in a home, and the director again said yes, but this time he didn't add anything else. To another question he replied that he had been surprised by my calm the day of the funeral. He asked what he meant by calm. The director then looked down at the tips of his shoes and said that he hadn't wanted to see Mammon, and that I hadn't cried once, and that I hadn't left right after the funeral without paying my last respects at her grave. And one other thing had surprised him. One of the men who worked for the undertaker had told him that I didn't know how old Mammon was. There was a brief silence, and then the judge asked him if he was sure that I was the man he had just been speaking of. The director hadn't understood the question, so the judge told him, "It's a formality." He then asked the prosecutor if he had any questions to put to the witness, and the prosecutor exclaimed, "Oh no, that is quite sufficient." With such glee and such triumphant look in the direction, with such glee and with such a triumphant look in my direction that for the first time in years I had this stupid urge to cry, because I could feel how much all these people hated me. After asking the jury and my lawyer if they had any questions, the judge called the caretaker. The same ritual was repeated for him and all the others. As he took the stand, the caretaker glanced at me and then looked away. He answered the questions put to him. He said I hadn't wanted to see Mammon, that I had smoked and slept some, and that I had had some coffee. It was then I felt a stirring go through the room, and for the first time I realized that I was guilty. The caretaker was asked to repeat the part about the coffee and the cigarette. The prosecutor looked at me with an ironic gleam in his eye. At that point, my lawyer asked the caretaker if it wasn't true that he had smoked a cigarette with me. But the prosecutor objected vehemently to this question. Who is on trial here, and what kind of tactics are these? Trying to taint the witnesses for the prosecution in an effort to detract from the testimony that remains nonetheless overwhelming? In spite of all that, the judge directed the caretaker to answer the question. The old man looked embarrassed and said, "I know I was wrong to do it, but I couldn't refuse the cigarette when Monsieur offered it to me." Lastly, I was asked if I had anything to add. "Nothing," I said, "except that the witness is right. Right, it's true. I did offer him a cigarette." The caretaker gave me a surprised and somehow grateful look. He hesitated, and then he said that he was the one who offered me the coffee. My lawyer was exultant and stated loudly that the jury would take note of the fact. But the prosecutor shouted over our heads and said, "Indeed, the gentlemen of the jury will take note of the fact, and they will conclude that a stranger may offer a cup of coffee, but that beside the body of one who brought him into the world, a son should have refused it." The caretaker went back to his bench. Why should he have refused it? Is that like a disrespectful thing? I haven't been to a lot of funerals in my life, so I could see it being like, why are you smoking in here? But like, I also wouldn't bat an eye if it was, well, that's just because smoking in general inside is pretty bad. So, I don't know. This also takes place in a completely different time where smoking was way more common. So, I don't know. When Thomas Perez's turns came, a bailiff had to hold him up and help him get to the witness stand. Perez said that it was really my mother he had known and that he had seen me only once, on the day of the funeral. He was asked how I had acted the day, and he replied, "You understand, I was too sad, so I didn't see anything. My sadness made it impossible to see anything. Because for me, it was a very great sadness, and I even fainted. So I wasn't able to see Monsieur." The prosecutor asked him if he had at least seen me cry. Perez answered no. The prosecutor in turn said, "The gentlemen of the jury all will take note." But my lawyer got angry. He asked Perez in what seemed to be an exaggerated tone of voice if he had seen me not cry. Perez said no. The spectators laughed, and my lawyer, rolling up one of his sleeves, said with finality, "Here we have a perfect reflection of this entire trial. Everything is true, and nothing is true. The prosecutor had a blank expression on his face, and with a pencil he was poking holes in the title page of his case file. After a 5-minute recess, during which my lawyer told me everything was working out for the best, we heard the testimony of Celeste, who was called in by the defense. The defense meant me. Every now and then Celeste would glance over in my direction and rotate his Panama hat in his hands. He was wearing the new suit he used to put on to go with me to races sometimes on Sundays, but I think he must not have been able to get his collar on because he only had a brass stud keeping his shirt fastened. He was asked if I was a customer of his, and he said yes, but he was also a friend. What he thought of me, and he answered that I was a man, what he meant by that, and he stated that everybody knew what that meant. If he had noticed that I was ever withdrawn, and all he would admit that... Whoa. He was asked if I was a customer of his, and he said yes, but he was also a friend. What he thought of me, and he answered that I was a man. What he meant by that, and he stated that everybody knew what that meant. If he had noticed that I was ever withdrawn, and all he would admit was that I didn't speak unless I had something to say. The prosecutor asked him if I kept up with my bill. Celeste laughed and said, between us, those were just details. He again asked what he thought about my crime. He put his hands on the edge of the box, and you could tell he had something prepared. He said, the way I see it, it's bad luck. Everybody knows what bad luck is. It leaves you defenseless. And there it is. The way I see it, it's bad luck. He was about to go on, but the judge told him that would be all and thanked him. Celeste was a little taken aback, but he stated that he had more to say. He was asked to be brief. He again repeated that it was bad luck, and the judge said, yes, fine, but we are here to judge just this sort of bad luck. Thank you. And as if he reached the end of both his knowledge and his goodwill, Celeste then turned toward me. It looked to me as if his eyes were glistening and his lips were trembling. He seemed to be asking me what else he could do. I said nothing. I made no gesture of any kind, but it was the first time in my life I ever wanted to kiss a man. The judge again instructed him to step down. Celeste went and sat among the spectators. He sat there throughout the entire trial, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, the Panama hat in his hands, listening to everything that was said. Honestly, this is one of the longer chapters. I'm a little surprised. I'm a little bit surprised. Let me just check something real quick. I don't know yet. I put it in a lunch with rice and peppers, so I'm going to find out tomorrow. Marie entered. She had put on a hat, and she was still beautiful. But I liked her better with her hair loose. From where I was sitting, I could just make out the slight fullness of her breasts, and I recognized the little pout of her lower lip. She seemed very nervous. Right away she was asked how long she had known me. She said since the time she worked in our office. The judge wanted to know what her relation to me was. She said that she was my friend. To another question she answered yes, it was true that she was supposed to marry me. Flipping through a file, the prosecutor asked her bluntly when liaison had begun. She indicated the date. The prosecutor remarked indifferently that if he was not mistaken, that was the day after Mammon died. Then, in a slightly ironic tone, he said that he didn't mean to dwell on such a delicate matter, and that he fully appreciated Marie's misgivings, but, and here as his tone grew firmer, that he was duty-bound to go beyond propriety. Jesus. So he asked Marie to describe briefly that day when I had first known her. Marie didn't want to. But at the prosecutor's insistence, she went over our swim, the movies, and going back to my place. The prosecutor said that after Marie had given her statements to the examining magistrate, She had consulted the movie listings for that day. He added that Marie herself would tell the court what film was showing. In an almost expressionless voice, she did in fact tell the court that it was a Fernandel film. By the time she had finished, there was complete silence in the courtroom. The prosecutor then rose, and very gravely, with what struck me as real emotion in his voice, his finger pointing at me, said slowly and distinctly, "Gentlemen of the jury, the day after his mother's death, this man was out swimming, starting up a dubious liaison, and going to the movies, a comedy, for laughs. I have nothing further to say." He sat down in the still silent courtroom. But all of a sudden Marie began to sob, saying it wasn't like that. There was more to it, and that she was being made to say the opposite of what she was thinking, and that she knew me and that I hadn't done anything wrong. But at a signal from the judge, the bailiff ushered her out, and the trial proceeded. Hardly anyone listened after that when Masson testified that I was an honest man, and that I'd even say a decent one. Hardly anyone listened to Salamano either. When he recalled how I had been good to his dog, and when he answered a question about my mother and me by saying that I had run out of things to say to Mammon, and that was why I had put her in the home. Honestly, you probably could still hear me. I just can't hear myself in the feedback. There we go. "You must understand," Salamano kept saying. "You must understand." But no one seemed to understand. He was ushered out. Next came Ramon, who was the last witness. He waved to me, and all of a sudden, he blurted out that I was innocent. But the judge advised him that he was being asked not for a judgment, but for facts. He was instructed to wait for the questions before responding. He was directed to state precisely what his relations with the victims were. Ramon took his opportunity to say that he was the one the victim hated ever since he had hit the guy's sister. Nevertheless, the judge asked him whether the victim hadn't also had a reason to hate me. Ramon said that my being at the beach was just chance. The prosecutor then asked him how it was that the letter that set the whole drama in motion had been written by me. Ramon responded that it was just chance. The prosecutor retorted that chance already had a lot of misdeeds on its conscience in this case. He wanted to know if it was just by chance that I hadn't intervened when Ramon had beaten up his girlfriend, just by chance that I had acted as a witness to the police station, and again, just by chance that my statements on that occasion had proved to be so convenient. Finishing up, he asked Ramon how he made his living, and when Ramon replied, "warehouse guard," the prosecutor informed the jury that it was common knowledge that the witness practiced the profession of procurer. I was his friend and accomplice. They had before them the basest of crimes, a crime made worse than sordid by the fact that they were dealing with a monster, a man without morals. Ramon wanted to defend himself, and my lawyer objected. But they were instructed that they must let the prosecutor finish. "I have little to add," the prosecutor said. "Was he your friend?" he asked Ramon. "Yes," Ramon said. "We were pals." The prosecutor then put the same question to me. I looked at Ramon. "Okay, thank you." The prosecutor then put the same question to me, and I looked at Ramon, who returned my gaze. I answered yes. The prosecutor then turned to the jury and declared, "The same man who the day after his mother died was indulging in the most shameful debauchery killed a man for the most trivial of reasons, and did so in order to settle an affair of unspeakable vice." He then sat down, but my lawyer had lost his patience, and, raising his hand so high his sleeves fell, revealing the creases of a starched shirt, he shouted, Come now, is my client on trial for burying his mother or for killing a man?" The spectators laughed. But the prosecutor rose to his feet again, adjusted his robe, and declared that only someone with the naivety, I'm going to assume some sort of naive, of his esteemed colleague would fail to appreciate that between those two sets of facts there existed a profound, fundamental, and tragic relationship. "Indeed," he loudly exclaimed, "I accuse this man of burying his mother with crime in his heart." The pronouncement seemed to have a strong effect on the people in the courtroom. My lawyer shrugged his shoulders and wiped the sweat from his brow, but he looked shaken himself, and I realized that things weren't going well for me. The trial was adjourned, As I was leaving the courthouse on my way back to the van, I recognized for a brief moment that the smell and color of the summer evening. In the darkness of my mobile prison, I could make out one by one, as if from the depths of my exhaustion, all the familiar sounds of a town I loved and a certain time of day when I used to feel happy. The cries of the newspaper vendors in the already languid air, the last few birds in the square, and the shouts of the sandwich sellers, the screech of the streetcars turning sharply through the upper town, and that hum in the sky before night engulfs the port. All this mapped out for me a route I knew so well before going to prison, which now I travel blind. Yes, it was the hour when, a long time ago, I was perfectly content. What awaited me back then was always a night of easy, dreamless sleep. And yet something had changed, since it was back to my cell that I went to wait for the next day, as if familiar paths traced in summer skies could lead as easily to prison as the sleep of the innocent. Alright, so that's chapter 3. On chapter 4. There are about 25 pages left. I'm doing this because this is acknowledgments. That's much of it left. So if I read the next chapter, it'll be that much. Okay. The ritual is now I try to summarize it to build and practice my retention. See if I really paid attention. My understanding was they were going through the court proceeding and they were interrogating witnesses. So first, well, okay, not first, but the most brief, the last ones I remember. Ramon and Salamano had almost no attention paid to them, right? And they actually tried using the fact that and they tried to use the fact that Ramon was a bad person and how Marsal wrote letters for him and procured as a witness for Ramon in certain crimes as a defense for him. And the prosecutor pointed out that, look, okay, he's a procurer. Okay, they're friends. They're acting together. So of course he's going to call him innocent, just as Marsal has done for him in the past. Marie was used to point out the fact that the day after his mother died, Marsal's mother died, he went out and a liaison, I'm not familiar with that term, this isn't clear. Okay, I don't know. I guess it just refers to like work colleagues, and because they did used to work together a long time ago, and how day after his mother died, he went out on a date and started like sleeping with women. They also used the Celeste at the restaurant, right? Used him, tried to use him, interrogate him. He came out and said he's a good man, you know. He just ran out of things to say about his mother, I believe. Or that was Salamano, I think. Salamano also pointed out how good he was to his dog, Marcel. They also asked the caretaker and the guy that's part of the home, the funeral home owner, I think. And he pointed out, hey, he didn't cry, he didn't say anything, he kind of just sat there and didn't say anything, smoked a cigarette, had some coffee. Which apparently was very bad and rude, I guess. I'm not familiar with that. Maybe that's a culture thing. Maybe I'm autistic. I don't know. And, yeah. So now we're going to watch a review. See how good my retention was. What's the point? Marcel's also realizing how guilty he is. The policeman everybody in there, after every time the prosecutor pointed out how, like, non-feeling he was about his mother's death, he started feeling the urge to cry for once. And he was like, man, everybody here hates me when I'm being judged for my reaction. Right, let's see. Let's see how well I did. Out of here, Dave Ramsey, or whoever the hell you are.
In part 2, chapter 3 of The Stranger, Rousseau attends his trial on a hot summer day. The jury appears to him as a group of faceless people. He watches the preliminaries of the trial and notes the friendliness of the people. Many reporters are in attendance, as are the witnesses, which include the director and caretaker from the nursing home, Raymond, Masson, Thomas Perez, Salamano, Celeste, and Marie. Even the little robot-like woman from Celeste's restaurant is in attendance. The judge questions Rousseau's motivation for placing his mother in a home. Rousseau responds by giving financial reasons. The prosecutor asks why, on the day of the killing, Rousseau was armed and returned to precisely the spot where he had previously confronted the victim. Rousseau says it just happened that way. The director is asked questions about Rousseau's attitude at his mother's funeral. The director says that Rousseau seemed calm, did not cry, and left without paying respects at the grave. The prosecutor seems pleased by these responses. Rousseau can feel hatred from the spectators in the courtroom. The caretaker, when questioned, says that Rousseau smoked, slept, and drank coffee at the funeral. The people in the courtroom seem stunned by this response.
Oh, he slept,
Rousseau
yeah.
comments to himself, I realized that I was guilty. When Celeste is questioned, the restaurant owner stresses his friendship with Rousseau and claims that his shooting of the victim was just bad luck. Rousseau feels grateful for Celeste's testimony. Marie testifies, admitting to getting romantically involved with Rousseau and going to see a comedy movie with him the day following his mother's funeral. During Raymond's questioning, he stresses that the Arab victim of the killing hated him, not Rousseau, and that Rousseau writing the letter that set the whole drama in motion was just chance. The prosecutor declares that Rousseau is a monster, a man without morals. The defense attorney wonders aloud whether his client is on trial for burying his mother or for killing a man, and the spectators laugh. As Rousseau is transported to his prison cell, he is aware of pleasant sensations, like the shouts of the sandwich sellers. The courtroom is described in terms of entertainment. Rousseau remarks that there really is not much difference between being on trial for a crime and being a source of humor for spectators. The courtroom functions as a symbol of society and its traditional views, suggesting that Rousseau is not on trial for a crime, but instead for his character. Society, not the court of law, is judging Rousseau for his non-traditional views. Albert Camus once summarized The Stranger by saying that a man who does not cry at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death.
There's definitely, like, I'm getting the literal story parts, but I'm like missing metaphors and underlining meanings of a lot of these. And I guess I'll just have to watch a few videos on it to really understand it, because I guess my retention's just that poor. Again, one of the main purposes for doing this is to try and make me a better reader, right? Because I can't be held by myself to do it. So if I have a documented log of it, I'll be able to more accurately see how I'm doing, measure myself. Okay, chapter 4. I don't know how many pages this is. It's a lot shorter than chapter 3. Chapter 3 was kind of crazy. How long was chapter 3? It was longer than most of the other chapters. That was about 16 pages. That was a killer chapter. Most of them have been like 10 pages. Alright. Chapter 4. Even in the prisoner's dock, it's always interesting to hear people talk about you. And during the summations by the prosecutor and my lawyer, there was a lot that was said about me, and maybe more than me about my crime. More about me than about my crime. But there were two speeches so different after. But were there two speeches so different after all? My lawyer raised his arms and pleaded guilty, but with an explanation. The prosecutor waved his hands and proclaimed my guilt, but without an explanation. One thing bothered me, a little though. Despite everything that was on my mind, I felt like intervening every now and then. But my lawyer kept telling me, just keep quiet, it won't do your case any good. In a way, they seemed to be arguing the case as if it had nothing to do with me. Everything was happening without my participation. My fate was being decided without anyone so much as asking my opinion. There were times when I felt like breaking in all of them and saying, wait a minute, who's the accused here? Being the accused counts for something, and I have something to say. But on the second thought, I didn't have anything to say. Besides, I have to admit whatever interest you can get people to take in you doesn't last very long. For example, I got bored very quickly with the prosecutor's speech. Only bits and pieces, a gesture or a long but isolated tirade, caught my attention or aroused my interest. The gist of what he was saying, if I understood him correctly, was that my crime was premeditated. At least that is what he tried to show. As he himself said, I will prove it to you, gentlemen, and I will prove it to you in two ways. First, in the blinding clarity of the facts. The second, in the dim light cast by the mind of his criminal What? Second, in the dim light cast by the mind of this criminal soul. He reminded the court of my insensitivity, of my ignorance when asked Mammon's age. That's right, he didn't know his mother's age when he was asked. That's rough. Throughout this entire thing, though, like, he's been giving me, like, sociopathic or highly autistic vibes, so he's kind of nailed there. He reminded the court of my insensitivity, of my ignorance when asked Mammon's age, of my swim the next day with a woman, of the Fernandale movie, a comedy, and finally of my taking Marie home with me. It took me a few minutes to understand the last part because he kept saying his mistress, and to me she was Marie. And then he came to the business with Ramon. I thought of this way of viewing the events had a certain consistency. I thought his way of viewing the events had a certain consistency. What he was saying was plausible. I had agreed with Ramon to write the letter in order to lure his mistress and submit her to mistreatment by a man of doubtful morality. I had provoked Ramon's adversaries at the beach. Ramon had been wounded. I had asked him to give me his gun. I had gone back alone intending to use it. I had shot the Arab as I had planned. I had waited, and to make sure I had done the job right, I fired 4 more shots. Calmly, point blank, thoughtfully, as it were. And there you have it, gentlemen, said the prosecutor. I've retraced for you the course of events which led this man to kill with full knowledge of his actions. I stress this point, he said, for this is no ordinary murder, no thoughtless act for which you might find mitigating circumstances. This man, gentlemen, this man is intelligent. You heard him, didn't you? He knows how to answer. He knows the value of words, and no one can say that he acted without realizing what he was doing. I was listening, and I could hear that I was being judged intelligent. But I couldn't quite understand how an ordinary man's good qualities could become crushing accusations against a guilty man. At least that was what struck me, and I had stopped listening to the prosecutor until I heard him say, Has he so much as expressed any remorse? Never, gentlemen. Not once during the preliminary hearings did this man show emotion over his heinous offense. At that point he turned in my direction, pointed his finger at me, and went on attacking me without my ever really understanding why. Of course I couldn't help admitting that he was right. I didn't feel much remorse for what I had done, and I was surprised by how relentless he was. I would have liked to have tried explaining to him cordially, almost affectionately, that I had never been able to truly feel remorse for anything. My mind was always on what was coming next, today or tomorrow. But naturally, given the position I'd been put in, I couldn't talk to anyone in that way. I didn't have the right to show any feeling or goodwill. And I tried to listen again because the prosecutor started talking about my soul. He said that he had peered into it and that he had found nothing. Gentlemen of the jury, He said the truth was that I didn't have a soul and that nothing human, not one of the moral principles that governs men's hearts, was within my reach. Of course, he added, we cannot blame him for this. We cannot complain that he lacks what it was not in his power to acquire. But here in this court, the wholly negative virtue of tolerance must give way to the sterner but loftier virtue of justice, especially when the emptiness of a man's heart becomes, as we find it has in this man, an abyss threatening to swallow up society. It was then that he talked about my attitude towards Mammon. He repeated that he had said earlier in the proceedings that it went on much longer than he was talking about my crime. So long, in fact, that finally I was all aware of how hot of a morning it was. At least until the prosecutor stopped, and after a short silence continued in a very low voice filled with conviction. Tomorrow, gentlemen, this same court is to sit in judgment of the most monstrous of crimes, the murder of a father. According to him, the imagination recoiled before such an odious offense. He went so far as to hope that human justice would meet. I don't know how you say that. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Justice would mete out punishment unflinchingly. But he wasn't afraid to say it. My callousness inspired in him a horror nearly greater than that which he felt at the crime of parricide. And also, according to him, a man who is morally guilty of killing his mother severs himself from society in the same way that as a man raises a murderous hand against a father who begat him. In any case, the one man paved the way for the deeds of the other, in a sense foreshadowed and even legitimized them. I am convinced, gentlemen, he added, raising his voice, that you will not think it too bold of me if I suggest that you... Oh, God, dude, the way they speak, it's frustrating. I'm not used to reading like this. I am convinced, gentlemen, he added, raising his voice, that you will not think it too bold of me if I suggest to you that the man who was seated in the dock is also guilty of the murder to be tried in this court tomorrow. He must be punished accordingly. Here the prosecutor wiped his face, which was glistening with sweat. He concluded by saying that his duty was a painful one, but that he would carry it out resolutely. He stated that I had no place in a society whose most fundamental rules I ignored, and that I could not appeal to the same human heart whose elementary response I knew nothing of. I ask you for this man's head, he said, and I do so with a heart at ease. For if in the course of what has been a long career I have had an occasion to call for the death penalty, never as strongly today as I have felt the painful duty made easier, lighter, clearer by the certain knowledge of a scared imperative, and by the horror I feel when I look into a man's face and all I see is a monster. When the prosecutor returned to his seat, there was a rather long silence. My head was spinning with heat and astonishment. The presiding judge cleared his throat and in a very low voice asked me if I had anything to add. I stood up, and since I did wish to speak, I said, almost at random in fact, that I had never intended to kill the Arab. The judge replied by saying that at least that was an assertion. Until then he hadn't quite grasped the nature of my defense, and that before hearing my lawyer he would be happy to have me state precisely the motives for my act. Fumbling a little with my words and realizing how ridiculous I sounded, I blurted out that it was because of the sun. People laughed. My lawyer threw up his hands, and immediately after that he was given the floor. But he stated that it was late and that he would need several hours. He requested that the trial be reconvened in the afternoon. The court granted his motion. The afternoon, the big fans were still churning. The thick air in the courtroom and the jurors' brightly colored fans were all moving in unison. It seemed to me as if my lawyer's summation would never end. At one point, though, I listened because he was saying, "It is true I killed the man." He went on like that, saying "I" whenever he was speaking about me. I was completely taken aback. I leaned over to one of the guards and asked him why he was doing that. He told me to keep quiet, and a few seconds later he added, "All lawyers do it." I thought it was a way to exclude me even further from the case, reduce me to nothing, and, in a sense, substitute himself for me. But I think I was already very far removed from that courtroom. Besides, my lawyer seemed ridiculous to me. He rushed through a plea of provocation, and then he too talked about my soul, but to me he seemed to be a lot less talented than the prosecutor. I too, he said, have peered into this man's soul, but unlike the esteemed representative of the government prosecutor's office, I did see something there, and I can assure you that I read it like an open book. What he read was that I was an honest man, a steadily employed, tireless worker, loyal to the firm that employed him, well-liked and sympathetic to the misfortunes of others. To him, I was a model son who had supported his mother as long as he could. In the end, I had hoped that a home for the aged would give the old woman the comfort that, with my limited means, I could not provide for her. Gentlemen, he added, I am amazed that so much has been made of this home, for after all, if it were necessary to prove the usefulness and importance of such institutions, all one would have to say is that it is the state itself which subsidizes them. The only thing is, he didn't say anything about the funeral, and I thought that was a glaring omission in his summation. But all the long speeches, all the interminable days and hours that people had spent talking about my soul had left me with the impression of a colorless, swirling river that was making me dizzy. In the end, all I remember is that while my lawyer went on talking, I could hear through the expanse of chambers and courtrooms an ice cream vendor blowing his tin trumpet out in the street. I was assailed by memories of a life that wasn't mine anymore, but one in which I had found the simplest and most lasting joys, the smells of summer, the part of town I loved, a certain evening sky, Marie's dresses and the way she laughed. The utter pointlessness of whatever I was doing there seized me by the throat, and all I wanted was to get it over with and get back to my cell and sleep. I barely even heard when my lawyer, wrapping up, exclaimed that the jury surely would not send an honest, hard-working man to his death because he had lost control of himself for one moment, and then he asked them to find it extenuating circumstances for a crime for which I was already suffering the most agonizing punishments, eternal remorse. Court was adjourned and my lawyer sat back down. He looked exhausted, but his colleagues came over to shake his hand. I heard, "That was brilliant." One of them even appealed to me as a witness. "Wasn't it?" he said. I agreed, but my congratulations weren't sincere because I was too tired. Meanwhile, the sun was getting low outside, and it wasn't as hot anymore. From what street noises I could hear, I sensed the sweetness of evening coming on. There we all were, waiting. And what we were waiting for was really concerned only me. I looked around the room again. Everything was the same as it had been the first day. My eyes met those of the little robot women and the reporter in the gray jacket. That reminded me that I hadn't tried to catch Marie's eye once during the whole trial. I hadn't forgotten about her. I'd just had too much to do. I saw her sitting between Celeste and Ramon. She made a little gesture as if to say, "At last." There was a little worried smile on her face, but my heart felt nothing, and I couldn't even return her smile. The judges came back in. Very quickly, a series of questions was read to the jury. I heard, "Guilty of murder, premeditated, extenuating circumstances." The jurors filed out, and I was taken to the little room where I had waited before. My lawyer joined me. He was very talkative and spoke to me more confidently and cordially than he ever had before. He thought that everything would go well and that I would get off with a few years in prison or at hard labor. I asked him whether he thought there was any chance of overturning the verdict if it was unfavorable. He said no. His tactic had not been to file any motion so as not to antagonize the jury. He explained to me that the verdicts weren't set aside just like that, for nothing. That seemed obvious, and I accepted his logic. Looking at it objectively, it made perfect sense. Otherwise, there would be too much pointless paperwork. Anyway, he said, we can always appeal, but I'm convinced that the outcome will be favorable. We waited a long time, almost 3/4 of an hour, I think. Then a bell rang. My lawyer left me, saying, "The foreman of the jury is going to announce the verdict. You'll only be brought in for the passing of sentence." Doors slammed. People were running on stairs somewhere, but I couldn't tell if they were nearby or far away. Then I heard a muffled voice reading something in the courtroom. When the bell rang again, the door to the dock opened. What rose to meet me was the silence in the courtroom. Silence and the strange feeling I had when I noticed that the young reporter had turned his eyes away. I didn't look in Marie's direction. I didn't have time to, because the presiding judge told me in bizarre language that I was to have my head cut off in a public square in the name of the French people. Then it seemed to me that I suddenly knew what was on everybody's face. It was a look of consideration, I'm sure. The policemen were very gentle with me. The lawyer put his hand on my wrist. I wasn't thinking about anything anymore. But the presiding judge asked me if I had anything to say. I thought about it. I said no. That's when they took me away. Bro's getting his head cut off in the town square? Jesus Christ, man. What time is it? 11:13? I mean, I kind of want to finish this. I kind of want to finish it. How many pages are left? I mean, annoying amount. About, yeah, about, oh wait, about the translation. About the author, okay. About that much is left. That's crazy. 108. No, I gotta go to bed. I'm gonna be exhausted tomorrow. Wow. Wow. Wow, okay. So, Marceau, supposedly the verdict was he's gonna get executed in the town square. I mean, holy Jesus Christ. In front of everybody. It's kind of crazy, I'm not gonna lie. So, okay, I'll summarize. So, for my retention, I'm gonna try to summarize this. So obviously he got sentenced to death penalty, right, in a brutal fashion where he's just gonna get his head cut off in the town square. They were reading their summaries, the prosecutor saying, look at this man. This is a man with crime in his soul. If there is a soul to begin with, you know, he has no place in our society for which there are rules that he will not have any intention of abiding by. And said that he looked into the soul of this man, the eyes of him, and found nothing. Nothing there. And I remember that. There was a couple chapters ago, he was interrogating him and pulled out a metal or a silver cross and said, you're yammering about Christ and stuff like that. And Marceau, being the sociopath, autistic dipshit he is, was like, hey man, I just don't. This isn't doing anything for me. I'm good. Thanks. Or he started saying, yes, I believe, just to get him to shut up, because he was irritated by it. Then the defense, his lawyer, Marcel's lawyer, said, hey, look, okay? This man's capable of love, alright? Look at Marie. This man took care of his mother for as long as he could, and eventually hoped that the home that he sent her to could offer her what he failed to. When he could no longer do it, could no longer afford it, and no longer had the time to do it, he hoped that a home could do better for her than what he could. And that he has talked to this man. He has seen Marcel's soul. He sees a man that's caring and did what he could with what he could. It's mentioned that he left out anything from the funeral, which kind of didn't look too good on the defense. That's all I can really remember. Yeah. So let's see the summary.
If you hate the way that your voice sounds, or maybe you just suck at speaking, let me put you on game. This is Vocal Image. It's an AI voice train.
I'm good. Alright, let's see.
In part 2, chapter 4 of The Stranger, in the courtroom, Marceau listens to the final speeches of the prosecutor and the defense attorney. At times, Meursault is tempted to interrupt, but he feels everything was happening without my participation. On second thought, he realizes he does not have anything to say. The prosecutor claims that Meursault's crime was premeditated. The attorney describes Meursault's heartlessness in the way he dealt with his mother's funeral, his affair with Marie, and his relationship with Raymond. Meursault believes that his good qualities are being used against him. The prosecutor accuses Meursault of not feeling any remorse for his crime, and Meursault admits to himself that he never felt much remorse about anything in his life. The prosecutor asserts that Meursault has committed a crime against society because he is morally guilty of killing his mother. The prosecutor asked the jury to condemn Meursault to death. The judge asks Meursault whether he has anything to say. Fumbling for words, Meursault tries to explain his actions on the day of the killing and ends up blurting out that the son made him shoot the victim, which makes people laugh. The defense attorney portrays Meursault as a loyal, hard worker and model son who is sympathetic to the misfortunes of other people. During his defense attorney's speech, Meursault remembers pleasant sensations of his life in Algiers. The attorney claims Meursault has lost control of himself for a moment when he shot the victim. He asked the jury not to issue the death penalty because of this momentary lapse of self-control. After the defense speech, Meursault looks around the courtroom and, for the first time that day, notices Marie, who wears a worried smile. The defense attorney is confident that Meursault will not be sentenced to death, but after almost an hour, Meursault is brought into the courtroom and hears his sentence. Guilty, the punishment being beheading in a public square. Meursault is taken away. The prosecutor paints a picture of Meursault as a heartless, soulless monster who intended to kill the victim. But his defense attorney also portrays Meursault in a false and absurd way, claiming that Meursault is a model son who had strong feelings for his mother and sympathizes with the misfortunes of others. The real Meursault exists outside both of these judgments. Meursault is not adept at reflection, explanation, or communication. As a result, he squanders the opportunity given to him and ends up sounding comical. A parallel between Meursault and Christ is drawn. While Meursault did commit a crime, he is put on trial not for the crime, but, like Christ, for beliefs that threaten authority figures.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, 100% gonna be back here tomorrow to finish that book. Very interested to see where it goes from there. It's just too late. If it wasn't 11, if it was like 10:45, I would crank it out, finish it, but unfortunately it's not, so I won't be. But pretty good book so far. I'm giving it like the first half was pretty slow up until the crime. The second half's a lot more interesting to me, a lot more. So we'll see where that goes tomorrow. Thank you for watching me and holding me accountable. I love you dearly. Be back tomorrow.